Welcome. This is Craig Svensson again, and glad to have you here for the third session of our Faith Community Institute class entitled Help for Those Living with Chronic Illness and Pain. Today's session is dealing with difficult medical issues, and I will tell you that most of the topics have been derived from my discussions with people either in preparation of my book, comments after the book, or from other talks that I have given, and I tried to pull together some things that people commonly raise in their questions that are difficult issues for them that I hopefully will give you some insight to that will help you in your own journey or help you come alongside someone in their journey for chronic illness. Over the next 3 sessions, I hope to cover the topics that are shown here. What to do when doctors won't listen. How do you deal with an uncertain diagnosis? How do you live with the diagnosis of an incurable disease? How do you think about unproven therapies? And how do you think through who to tell? And then we'll close out the third session in this section by pointing you to some helpful resources, including some websites that I think you might find helpful for future information that are either disease specific or that are very general that might be of use to you. I would also like to remind you that you can submit questions to my email address that is shown here. It's also at the top of the handout that you could have downloaded at the website. If you have questions about the material we have covered, or perhaps topics I haven't covered, you can submit those questions there, and as I indicated in our first session, we'll put those together, and if we have enough questions, that's what will be the focus of session number 10, trying to address those questions. The key message that I hope you will take from all of this is you have to take charge of your health. You know, there are times when you feel so sick, you just want to do whatever somebody else tells you to do, right? You just feel terrible. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I just want to feel better. But when you're living with a chronic illness, one particularly that is complex, one for which there is no cure, you really have to take your health into your own hands. You have to be proactive. You have to be actively engaged. And if because of physical reasons you cannot do that, you need an advocate on your behalf. Our health system is simply too fragmented, too inconsistent in its quality, and too time constrained to trust yourself into the hands of other people without being discerning, question asking, and other ways of probing to be proactive about your own health. You simply must take charge of your health when you're living with a chronic illness, if you're going to thrive in the midst of that illness. Have you ever found yourself in this unhappy place? Perhaps while on the phone with a customer service for an airline or for an insurance company. I mean, why is it that they have to route you to 5 or 6 different people just to prove nobody there can answer your question or solve your problem, right? Well, we've all probably been there. Hopefully we've responded a little bit better than this poor gal, but we've all had those periods of frustration over issues that somebody should be able to resolve. It's not that big a deal. We get over them. We express our frustration when they happen. But what about when your frustration is not being able to get answers about your health? Then you might feel like poor little Charlie Brown. Many patients have had an experience of emerging symptoms, and they go to provider after provider, and no one can give them an answer. And like poor Charlie Brown, you just wonder what's wrong with you. What's going on in your body that's leaving you with these feelings? And you'd just like somebody to be able to tell you what's going on. Often during the journey, patients will feel like this poor young gal. Nobody takes me seriously. I have heard this from so many patients of going to a provider and they just don't take their complaints seriously. In fact, I have my own account that I've recorded in my book about my own experience with that, of a gastroenterologist that certainly didn't take my complaints seriously prior to having been diagnosed with colitis. This is a common experience for patients. So what do you do when you feel like doctors won't listen? How do you respond when you find yourself in this situation? And I want to spend some time talking about this. It's such a common phenomenon, and it's something that we need to know how to address. I think it begins, first of all, by understanding why it happens, why we're left with that feeling. Sometimes it's a legitimate feeling. Sometimes it's a perception that perhaps isn't valid. And then I want to talk about setting reasonable expectations, which can help us prevent from walking away from a visit feeling like we weren't listened to. And then I want to talk about how to prepare for your visit, which, as much as anything else, is a key to dealing with this issue of feeling like doctors aren't listening to you. And then talk a little bit about how you advocate for yourself, because this is really important when you're living with a chronic illness. The first point is to recognize why. Why do we often get left with the feeling that our clinician isn't listening to us? We've told the story, or at least tried to get it in, but they don't really seem to be listening. They're rushed. They're not paying much attention. Well, here's one reason why. This is data from the Centers for Disease Control Vital Statistics Group. And what they found is that the average physician visit lasts 18 minutes. And only about 3.5 minutes is devoted to an actual physical exam. Now, this is an average. So this includes complex and simple. Some visits are considerably shorter of that. I'm sure you've had that experience of 5 minutes or less with a physician. And so it's a pretty limited period of time that exists. The simple reality is that today, most physicians operate under an enormous strain to see a large number of patients. And one of the biggest complaints that I hear from physicians is they feel like they don't have enough time to give to their patients, because the patient load they're expected to carry is so high that they're scheduled for just 15 minutes to spend with the patients. And it's really hard for them to do the job that they want to do. It's as much a system problem as anything else. It's the burden that exists with the amount of patients that both specialists and non-specialists are expected to see. But there's also a problem with the way physicians often conduct themselves during a visit. Some former colleagues of mine at another institution I was at before I came to Purdue did an interesting study. They recorded a number of primary care visits with physicians, and they asked a number of different fascinating questions. But one of the questions they asked was the one that's shown here. They asked, how long did a patient get to speak and talk about their complaint, to talk about the problem that brought them in before they were interrupted? So we're talking about the initial statement. How long did they get to tell their story before they were interrupted? You want to take a guess at how long that was? Here's the data. 18 seconds. 18 seconds, that's all. Now, there was a range, but the average time that a patient got to speak before being interrupted, trying to tell what their chief complaint was only 18 seconds. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to tell somebody a story, if I'm trying to tell them something that happened, recounting an event, and I get interrupted, well, sometimes I lose my train of thought, right? I forget what I was going to say, or I certainly don't say it with the clarity that I hope to say. So this interruption of patients when they're trying to communicate is a serious problem. And obviously that's a physician training problem that has become more widely recognized, but it still persists as a significant problem. The inability of patients being able to tell their story uninterrupted. Now, one of the reasons that sometimes happens is that physicians often encounter people who are, they tell stories that are just too long and that are not relevant. They get into things that don't focus on the issue at hand, and so they fall into this practice of interrupting people quickly. So how do we deal with these issues? The fact that, number one, there's a limited amount of time, and number two, that the amount of time you're actually going to get to speak before you get interrupted is probably pretty short. Well, it begins by setting reasonable expectations for your visit. First of all, you need to be reasonable about the amount of time they're going to have. Now, that will vary with the purpose. If you're going in for an annual physical, for example, it will be scheduled for more time than if you're going in for a follow-up or if you're a first-time patient. But you have to realize there's a clock ticking in the clinician's head when they visit you. They've only got so much time before they've got to get to the next patient. So recognize that your time is limited. See it as something of great value and use it wisely. The second thing is you need to set reasonable expectations about their memory. I don't know how many people's stories you could recall right now if I asked you to tell me about 4 people that you encountered over the last 10 days and tell me the significant things about them. I would dare say it would be very few that you could remember, right? So the simple fact of the matter is you can't expect a clinician to remember much from your last visit. Now, they do have a chart. There is information that's there, but it's limited. It's somewhat cryptic. It's a limited amount of information, and they only have so much time to review it before they see you because they've got more patients before you and they've got patients after you. So you have to realize that you can't trust that they remember the most important information about you. You may need to recount that. They're going to know what your diagnosis is if there is one. But the history or symptoms and other things, they may not. They may not remember much of anything about the last visit, if anything at all. So have reasonable expectations about what they will and will not remember. You ought to also have reasonable expectations about the content of your conversation. Specifically, avoid irrelevant topics. You might have had a great vacation, but there's no reason for you to spend your time telling them about it because you're just wasting time that could be used more importantly. It's not important to get their feelings on what they thought about the game Saturday because that's not going to help your health, right? Avoid irrelevant topics. Keep the focus. If you got more time at the end and they seem like they're not rushing out the door, you've got everything out there, then you can get into those conversations if you want. But keep the focus specifically at the beginning on the things that are most important to get through during your visit. The other expectations you have is respect, and this respect should go both ways. You have every reason to expect that they will respect you, that they'll respect your time, that they'll respect you as a person, that they'll respect your feelings and your knowledge about your own health. They should never be dismissive of you as a person and of what you voice about your concerns. If they are, then you've got a significant problem with that clinician. But they also have every reason to expect that you will respect them. Respect their time. Respect their expertise. Don't dismiss it. You've gone to them for a reason. They have lots of training and experience, and you should respect that. You also have every reason to expect that they will listen. Listening is so very important. When I took physical assessment and differential diagnosis many years ago, what was drilled into our heads was that about 90% of all diagnoses are made on the medical history. Not the physical exam, not the laboratories, it's made based on the history. And every physician knows this, that it is based on the history is where they're going to get the most important information. And so they have to be good listeners. And if you have a clinician that shows a regular pattern of not listening well, then you ought to be concerned about whether that's a clinician you should stay with. Now, we all have bad days, right? And they have things going on in their private life. And they might be distracted on a particular day. For all you know, the patient that they saw just before you, they had to tell them that they have a terminal illness and only have months to live. And now they've gone from that room to seeing you. It wouldn't be surprised if their mind might be a little elsewhere when they come see you, right? They're human beings. So physicians can have bad days too. and we need to cut them some slack. But if we get the sense that they're not listening, we can challenge that. And we should, because listening is critically important to their jobs. And if they don't do it well, they can't do their job well. Another thing that we can do is to prepare for our visit. It's so important to do this. Many people show up for visits with their physician without having given significant forethought to those visits. That is not a good way to walk away from that visit having felt like it was a productive visit. We really need to think carefully about why we're visiting our clinician and what it is they need to know and how we can help them with that information. And it begins by identifying before your visit what are the most important matters to be addressed, right? Minor things that aren't of concern don't need to be brought up. You want to focus on the things that are most concerning about your health. And that really focuses on issues that are doing one of two things. Either they're impacting the way you live life. Those are things that are real important to make sure they hear. Or are there things that you're worrying about, that you find yourself chewing over? Those are things important to get cleared up and addressed from them as well. One of the ways that you can help is to keep a health diary, particularly when you have a difficult disease or a disease that has symptoms that wax and wane. To keep a health diary so that you're not just wondering what's going on, but rather you can describe specifically what's going on. And one of the things that you can do from a health diary, if you keep a record of your symptoms, is you can prepare a summary of key symptoms. Any clinician needs to know key factors about symptoms. When did they start? What's the onset? How often do they occur? What's the frequency? How bad are they? What's the severity? And the best way of expressing severity isn't on a scale of 1 to 10. That's used really commonly. It's not particularly helpful. It's far better to express severity based on what it impairs your ability to do. I can't sit for more than 15 minutes before the pain is so great I just can't walk. Or I used to be able to walk up to my office the 3 flights of stairs in the morning, but now I can't. I have to take the elevator. I get out of breath after the 2nd flight of stairs. Describing severity of your symptoms in terms of how it's impairing your normal functioning is most helpful because it lets them really see how it's influencing your life. And then the fourth thing is, what makes it worse? What makes it better? What precipitates it? What alleviates it? Those are the key things that a clinician needs to know. If you have that prepared ahead of time, and as you're telling your story, you can communicate. You know what? I've been keeping a diary, and for the last 2 months, I've had headaches 3 times a week. And most often, I have to leave work early and go and lay down in a dark room, and it takes about 3 hours for it to pass. It's not any quicker going away if I take Tylenol or not. I've tried ibuprofen, that doesn't do anything. Now, if you communicate it that way, you've given really important information to the clinician. And they know, first of all, they've got a sense of the measure of the frequency now, when it happened, when did it start, how severe it is, how it's impacting your life. You've done a lot of their work for them, and you save a tremendous amount of time. The other thing you want to do is make sure you write down important questions. I don't know about you, but if I go to a grocery store, which I try to avoid, but if I do go to a grocery store, if I have in my head the things I'm supposed to get, I'm pretty certain to leave forgetting at least one item, right? I have to have a list. And I have to check that list when I walk into the store, as I'm going through the store, and when I think I've got everything, I got to go through the list again. Because if I don't, sure shooting, I'm going to forget something. And the same thing can happen if you go into a visit with your physician. If you don't have things written down, there's a good chance you're going to leave and say, I meant to tell him this, or I meant to ask about this, and I didn't. Write down those questions. It's okay to have a piece of paper with you or have it written on your smartphone that you've got the sound turned off of so you can pull it up and, okay, here's some questions I want. That's all a part of preparing for your visit. That's how we can get the optimal experience in a visit that admittedly is going to be limited in time. One of the most common complaints I've heard from specialists is when patients show up in the exam room and hand them a stack of papers, parts of their medical record. And now they're trying to get the medical history, trying to do a brief physical, and also digest this pile of papers that have just been handed to them. If you have significant medical records, it is really helpful if you can drop those off in advance. They might not have time to look at them, but at least you've given them the opportunity to do that. If they're in a separate medical system, particularly, they don't have access to it electronically. On the other hand, for example, if you're in IU Health, and no matter where in IU Health you go, they can all access records that are there. They can see summaries and everything like that. But if you're moving from one system to another, you're going to have to get copies of the records. You're going to have to request that they be sent. But it's best if that be taken care of ahead of time, if at all possible. And fourth, you have to advocate for yourself. You have to be willing to be an advocate. It's very easy to be passive when you don't feel well. But when you're living with a chronic illness, especially a complex disease, it's no time for sitting back and letting what come. Sometimes you have to be assertive and you have to redirect conversation. You may bring up an issue that you think is really important, and suddenly the clinician goes off in a different direction. You might have to pull back and say, wait a minute, the biggest problem right now is that my knee is really hurting, but it doesn't seem like you think that's important. Could you tell me why? So there are ways that you can ask them questions when your concerns seem to be ignored. Again, remember, they're human. They have good days, they have bad days. They have things that distract them. They have things on their mind. And sometimes you need to pull them back and focus, help them center on the issue that they should be giving their attention to in the here and now. Sometimes you may run into a provider who seems pretty consistently to be distracted. They're not giving you your attention. They don't seem to be listening well. They seem to ignore your biggest complaints. Well, it may be then that you need to change providers. If you don't have a clinician that you have confidence in, then there is no reason for you to stay with them. Because in fact, if you don't have confidence in them, they can't fulfill their job. They simply can't. Going to see a clinician isn't like a marriage. It's not till death do you part. You can change, and you should. If you do not feel like you are getting the care that you should be receiving, don't hesitate to change. If you can't improve it by talking to them, if you can't improve the relationship, then find another clinician. When you're living with a chronic illness, there is no reason to stay with somebody who you feel is not providing optimal care to you. Another issue that is often faced by people that are living with chronic illness is the uncertainty of diagnosis. This is a real common issue for a lot of diseases, most especially for degenerative diseases. One of the things to recognize is that you're not alone. Medical uncertainty is actually common. In fact, there was a piece not long ago in the New England Journal of Medicine by two medical educators advocating that medical schools need to do a better job of teaching clinicians how to deal with medical uncertainty, because it's uncomfortable for them too, not knowing what's wrong with a patient. So it's a significant issue. It's common. You're not alone. There are many patients who have gone through significant periods of time with uncertainty in terms of their diagnosis. One of the reasons for this is there's a lot of diseases that can mimic one another. And I've given you some examples here. Fibromyalgia can mimic lupus. It can mimic multiple sclerosis, polymyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and other diseases. So early on in a lot of these diseases, people might be labeled as fibromyalgia, but that's not actually what they've got. They've got something else. But a lot of diseases have similar types or overlapping symptoms and signs. And it makes it hard to determine for certainty, what does a patient have? There's also patients, a lot of patients, who have what are called medically unexplained symptoms, or MUS. It occurs with pretty high frequency. And these are simply symptoms for which there is no clear organic explanation. We have no label of disease to put on them. Their symptoms just don't fit into a category that we have. To give you an example, there was a study that was done in primary care patients in England, and they found that 25% of patients who visited primary care clinics had medically unexplained symptoms. They often were fatigue, or pain, or gastrointestinal, and there was no clear cause for their symptoms. That's quite common, a quarter of patients that were going into the clinic. Now, here's something I want to emphasize. The fact that there's no medical explanation doesn't mean they're real. Okay? Just because we don't know the reason why somebody's experiencing something doesn't mean they're not experiencing it. Doesn't mean their symptoms are not real. It may be a disease that is unknown. It may be that they have a disease that is emerging, but not enough symptoms to categorize it as a disease. There's lots of different reasons why symptoms might be medically unexplained. And it's sometimes true that medically unexplained symptoms don't arise from pathology in the site where the symptoms present, and they might respond best to behavioral interventions. A good example, there are some people who, when they do public speaking, they get a racing heart. I mean, a really racing heart. It feels like it is pounding in them. They may get dizzy. There's nothing wrong with their heart. It's not the issue. It's their body's response to stress. They don't have a disease. They're responding to a stressful situation. And there are ways to help people learn how to manage that. There's behavioral interventions, and there are even some medications that we can help to slow the heart to prevent them from having that. But those patients are best served by recognizing there's nothing wrong with your heart. That's not what's going on here. And we have behavioral interventions that we can help you deal with that. And there are other types of symptoms that are that way as well. I mean, some people, when they speak, they get tremendous gastrointestinal symptoms, severe cramping, and some even develop diarrhea when it's time to speak. They get so stressed out. There's nothing wrong with their gut. It's their response to stress. And we need to help them learn how to manage stress in a healthy way so that they don't get those symptoms. The symptoms are very real, but they're not due to a disease in the organ where they're feeling those symptoms. Another important element to remember is that time is often a key ingredient in diagnosis. Time. It takes time. As more symptoms, more signs become evident, then a diagnosis can be made. This is an interesting little time scale. There's a gal who writes a blog who has MS, and she just polled a couple people she knew that had MS and asked them a simple question. How long between symptoms first emerging for you did it take before you had a diagnosis of MS? And this scale here just shows that. And you can see Jerry, 3 days, real quick. Sarah, it was 4 weeks. Carrie, it was 4 months. Stephanie, it was 9 months. The author was 5.5 years, and Anne, it took 8 years. 8 years of emerging symptoms before she received a diagnosis. I heard one guy's testimony. He had lived for 17 years. Think about that, 17 years, almost 2 decades, with this variety of emerging symptoms that no one was able to pin a label on until he ultimately met the diagnostic criteria for multiple sclerosis. But for 17 years, he lived with medical uncertainty. In fact, studies show that 50% of patients with MS require more than 2 years before they get a formal diagnosis. Parkinson's disease often has a prodromal phase. That prodromal phase, meaning there's emerging symptoms, but it doesn't meet the criteria for Parkinson's disease itself. Usually it takes about 2 to 5 years before they get those level of symptoms. But sometimes that prodromal period may last longer than 2 decades. What that means is patients are going through 20 years, as much as 20 years, with emerging symptoms, and no one's quite sure what is going on until finally they meet the criteria. You've got Parkinson's disease. Then they can look back over the last 2 decades and say, now I know why I was having those symptoms. Now I know what was causing them. But that's hard to live with. That's a long period of time to struggle with not knowing what is wrong with you. There was a study that was done in the United Kingdom of women who had endometriosis. And on average, it took them 7.5 years before they received a diagnosis. So between the time that symptoms began, they would go through a variety of clinicians trying to find out what was going on. It took 7.5 years before they were accurately diagnosed. That's a long period of time to live with uncertainty, but it's the common experience of people who have complex disorders. You know, periods of waiting are inevitable in life. I mean, diseases and a diagnosis aren't the only areas, right? But what's really important is how we wait. How we wait. And as believers in Jesus, this is something that we all have to learn. How do we wait in difficult times? Whether what we're waiting for is a period of looking for a job that we're unemployed, or single and wondering what our future life is. Is it alone? Is it married? Is it with a disease? We don't even know what we've got. We've got all these symptoms. So waiting is a part of life. And what we need to do is learn to be with the psalmist and say, let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. Another key principle to recognize is that uncertainty is better than a misdiagnosis. You know, there's something within us that wants to really know what's wrong with us, and we can actually push clinicians. We can just not be satisfied when somebody says, you know, we really don't know what's going on yet. We can't tell. Could be a couple things, but we can't tell. Sometimes people just can't live with that, and so they just go visit new people until someone's willing to put a label on them. But what's really important to understand is that a misdiagnosis can be harmful. It can be very harmful. Here's some interesting statistics. 1 out of 20 patients, adult patients, is misdiagnosed every year in the United States. That's about 12 million people receive a wrong diagnosis. And half of those, it's estimated, could be potentially harmful. Let me give you some numbers. A study was done by the Multiple Sclerosis Society, and they found that 42% of people that answered the survey had been misdiagnosed with something prior to receiving a diagnosis of MS. 42%. I saw a study that was done by 2 well-regarded MS centers in California. And they went and looked through the records of people over a period of about a decade, I guess it was, that had come and been referred to by one source or another to their MS center. And they asked a couple questions, and one of them was, how many people came here with a diagnosis of MS, and we evaluated them and found they actually had something else? Now, almost every one of these was referrals from neurologists, from specialists, right? People who should have known. And yet they found a substantial fraction of people that came to their center with a diagnosis of MS, and that's not what they had. They had something else. There were people who had, for 10 to 20 years, been receiving treatment for MS, but that's not actually what they had. Imagine that. Being treated for 2 decades for disease that you don't actually have. It's obviously not going to give you any benefit. You're just going to live with the risk. But that's the reality for some people. Fibromyalgia is particularly difficult to diagnose. And what is especially true is that the symptoms tend to be nondescript. They tend to be fairly global. They tend to fluctuate. And they are similar to a number of other diseases. There was a careful study that was done that looked at a group of patients who had received a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. And what they found is that 65%, over half of them, actually had some other disease. They had been misdiagnosed. That's why in our first session, when I gave you the numbers of people who have been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, I said it's really hard to tell what to do with that number. Because this is one of those diseases that is wrongly diagnosed with a high degree of frequency. Another example would be endometriosis. I referred to a study on this earlier. They found that 75% of people had received a misdiagnosis, 75% of the women who had been diagnosed with endometriosis they had received a misdiagnosis before they actually received their accurate diagnosis. Now, these numbers might scare you. You might say, oh my goodness, there's a whole lot of medical errors going on out there. Well, we're talking about complex diseases here. What you should know is that in primary care, about 80 to 90% of cases are diagnosed accurately. More times than not, clinicians are right in their diagnosis. The times when problem arises are when you have complex and rare disorders. And so that then leads us to consider, well, how can I make sure I get a right diagnosis then? If I recognize that chronic ailments, particularly chronic ailments that are complex and chronic ailments that might even be rare, if they are often misdiagnosed, how can I make sure I get the right diagnosis? And that's very important. The path to getting the right treatment begins with getting the right diagnosis, right? So let me give you some keys. One is patience, and I've referred to this already. It's important to recognize that sometimes the flip of the calendar is the most important diagnostic tool. That the reality is nobody can tell you what is wrong until more symptoms emerge or until certain diagnostic tests become positive. That's the case, for example, with MS right now. Many people have a period of time where they have symptoms that look like they're MS, but when you do an MRI scan, nothing's showing up. But in time, suddenly plaques show up in their central nervous system or on their spinal cord, and bam, it's clear. You've got MS. But until that time, it's not clear what you've got. And we have to have patience. We have to recognize that we can't always have answers when we want them. And we don't want to miss diagnosis. So being patient, it's hard, but being patient, watching over time, is often the best route to getting the right diagnosis. Having a careful health diary can really help. Making sure you're doing a good job of recording your symptoms so that patterns can emerge. And there's good documentation of what's happening, when it's happening, how it's progressing, etc. I can't stress enough when people are going through a period of time of medical uncertainty, the value of keeping a health diary. And there are apps, if you want to put that on your smartphone, that can help you do that. And we'll even give you prompts to remind you each day to enter certain things. And then thirdly is second opinions. Second opinions are really important. And second opinions should always be given by a specialist, but not just a specialist in the broadest sense, but someone who is expert in the disease with which you have been diagnosed. So if you are diagnosed with an unusual disorder, if you are diagnosed with a complex disorder, you would do well to have a second opinion. In fact, anybody who is going to have significant treatment, a significant course of treatment they're going to undergo for a disease, really ought to have a second opinion. This is such an important issue. We're going to devote the beginning of our next session on when you should get a second opinion, where you should go, and how you find those kind of experts. I hope you'll join us for that session. Let me close this with a word of prayer. Father, we've considered a lot of practical issues today, things that actually sometimes are really challenging because it focuses on the area of uncertainty. There's so much we don't know. And that's so very true when it comes to our health, that there aren't always answers. The clinicians cannot always pin a label and give us the direction that we should go. But Lord, we know that you know, and that you are in control. And I pray that you would help us wait in the seasons of life that require us to wait, and that we would wait well. Wait with confidence in you, that we are always in your loving care, that you are our rock and refuge, and that we will not fear, even though the earth shakes, melts away, whatever happens, we can stand fast in the goodness of our God and his care for us. Ask all these things in the gracious name of Jesus. Amen.